Hello, my name is Altay Coskun, and I'm going to talk to you about the efficacy of Seleukid ideology. The same is also the title of chapter 15 in Seleukid Ideology, Creation, Reception and Response, a volume co-edited by Richard Wenghofer and myself. Richard and I have been having conversations about Seleukid ideology, or more broadly political ideology, at least since 2016. And after discussing several case studies that look at the creation and the spread of ideological motifs, we asked ourselves the questions: how effective were the Seleucids in disseminating their ideology, and how much did this contribute to the stability of their kingdom? We agreed that it's very difficult to actually know what the belief of the subjects were, and it's also not easy to measure loyalty. Now, Richard chose a realist approach to the problem. And while we do agree that honest feelings of subjects cannot be known, his emphasis is more on expressions of loyalty being made under constraints, under force, or at least in the face of a more powerful king. So he claims that we cannot take their expressions of loyalty, their expressions of the greatness of the king, as well as factual or at least as honest expressions, but rather we should accept them as expressions of conceding to the superiority of the king. And the case study that he investigates for the Seleukid ideology volume further considers a couple of examples in which cities, in their diplomatic exchange with the king, use the ideology of the royal ideology of the Seleukid kings to achieve their own political aims. I personally prefer a constructivist approach to notions such as ideology, legitimacy, loyalty, and freedom. For example, if you buy a rifle and unpack it and then finally grab the manual, you would be quite unhappy if that were written by a constructivist, telling you about all ways of trying to get into the psychology of your enemy, first trying to establish peace, to reconciliate. What you do want to know in that moment is how to load your gun and how to pull the trigger. To the same degree, I think realists would be or have only a very limited understanding of these notions: ideology, legitimacy, loyalty, and freedom, because these notions do not have an essence in themselves. They do not exist if they are just claimed by a king, by his court, but only through communication and through perception they they gain an existence, and they potentially become politically powerful tools or even weapons. So I explored these thoughts specifically for the Seleucids in 3 articles, and the one that I have written for the Seleukid ideology volume pursues a couple of examples that want to show that it was more typical for the Seleucid kingdom that subjects were loyal than disloyal. And I chose a number of examples where the king was actually weak and not in a position to coerce certain subjects group to give him support. I start with the Babylonians because Babylon is also the beginning of Seleucid rule. Seleucus I started as a satrap in the city of Babylon in 320 and seems to have established a positive relation to his subjects. When he had to flee in 316, but when he returned with an army in 312, 311, it is said in our sources that the subjects voluntarily chose his side over that of his opponents, Antigonos Monophthalmos and Demetrios Poliorketes. So It's a very rare expression in our ancient sources that the emphasis is put on the loyalty of the subjects rather than on the greatness of the king himself. Now, this anecdote has not found that much traction in the scholarly debate because a few years after the return, Seleucus founded the city of Seleucia on the Tigris to make it into his main residence. And only another few years later, he founded city in Syria, most of all Seleucia in Pieria and Antioch on the Orontes, and these then became his main residences. So does this mean that the relation with the Babylonians were negative, or well, this is what most scholars suggest, also based on another anecdote that reflects fears and disappointments, tensions by some Babylonians at the point when Seleucus was founding Seleucia. I, however, prefer that we read this anecdote in a more positive light because the gist is that the Babylonians did not want Seleucus to leave. And then they designed a plot in order to make that not happen. However, Seleucus understood this plot but pardoned the Seleucians, and the anecdote ends on a positive note. Okay, this is only a construction and we do not put too much emphasis on it. But if we do want to draw on this anecdote as a source, we should read it as something positive. More important are examples of military conflict when the Seleucids did not control Babylon but were actually depending on the support of the Babylonians. My first example is from the Third Syrian War. In 246, Ptolemy III invaded the especially Syria after also making conquests in Asia Minor. And it was a time when it was believed that Seleucus II had been killed initially, but then he showed up again somewhere in Media, and it was quite difficult for him to bring together a new army. So that was an opportunity for Ptolemy to also cross the Euphrates and intrude into Mesopotamia and Babylonia. He was very successful initially in Mesopotamia, but in Babylon, his campaign was halted. There was very fierce resistance to him in Babylon, and there is no evidence that he ever did occupy Seleucia on the Tigris or any other location south of Babylon. So that is a major point in the successful return of Seleucus II and gradually also in his victory in this war. Let's jump 100 years forward and look into the rule of Demetrius II. He provides very good examples for a king who was relatively weak after the dynasty had been eroding. The kingdom had been eroding very quickly after 150. Yet after Babylonia had been gradually slipping from the control of the Seleucids, Demetrius only had to show up initially in his reign, and they returned under his control without even fighting. And although a few years later Demetrius was having very difficult problems against the usurper Diodotos Tryphon in Syria, and most of the Syrian cities actually changed sides to the insurgent, he could not take any possessions in Babylonia. And we have a third example under the same Demetrius. After the Parthian king Mithridates had invaded Media, Mesopotamia, and Babylonia, Demetrius only had to come back with an army which may not even have been stronger as that of the Parthian king, but once again the Babylonians changed sides immediately. Yet, as we know, Demetrius was later captured by the king in Media, so that Demetrius was succeeded by his brother Antiochus VII. But it took Antiochus a couple of years to solidify his control of Syria and the Levant before he again embarked on an anabasis, on an eastern campaign, and we see once again that the Babylonians immediately changed sides when the king arrived. But this king, as we know, was ambushed in Media and killed in 129. And that's only the situation after which Babylonia and Mesopotamia would never return to the Seleucid kings. So this is my prime example, but I have several other minor examples that I talk about in my article, that is on the cities of Ilion and Smyrna, which showed significant loyalty to the Seleucid kings in certain periods, and I show how much they were actually pursuing their own political advantage by cooperating with the king. And then I have two more examples on the dynast Olympicos of Caria and of the high priests of Judea, many of which also had a big advantage of cooperating with the Seleucid kings and making, well, their own position or seeing that their own position and their recognition by their own subjects would benefit a lot by their agreement, acting in agreement with the king. If you are curious to learn more about the loyalty in the Seleucid kingdom, you may try out my longer survey of the same topic following the YouTube link you find on this last slide, or you may explore much more on Seleucid ideology and Seleucid history on the website altaycoskun.com.